Picture this. The year is negative, 7,100,000. The good news, life is everywhere. The bad news, none of it looks remotely familiar. You've just opened your eyes in a world that existed long before your great-great-grandmother's great-great-grandmother was even a glimmer in evolution's eye. This isn't the Africa you know from nature documentaries. This is a continent in the throes of dramatic transformation, where massive geological forces are literally ripping the land apart. The Great Rift Valley is beginning to form, creating a colossal scar across eastern Africa that will eventually stretch for thousands of miles. Volcanic activity rumbles constantly in the distance. The climate is shifting from lush, humid forests to drier, more open landscapes. And in this crucible of change, something extraordinary is happening. The ancestors of every human being who has ever lived are taking their first tentative steps toward becoming us. But here's what makes this moment so incredible. They're not alone. Sharing this ancient world with our earliest ancestors is a menagerie of creatures so bizarre, so magnificent, and so terrifying that they seem pulled from mythology. These aren't just background characters in the story of human evolution. They are the sculptors, the architects, the very forces that molded our lineage into what we would become. Let me paint you a picture of this primordial theatre. Imagine stepping into forests where the trees tower higher than modern skyscrapers, their canopies so thick that sunlight barely penetrates to the forest floor. The air is thick with humidity and alive with sounds you've never heard before. Calls that echo through the mist, footsteps that shake the ground, and the constant rustle of creatures moving through vegetation so dense it forms walls of green. Now here's where it gets fascinating. In this world, our ancestors weren't the dominant species. They weren't even close. They were small, vulnerable primates trying to navigate an environment filled with predators that could crush them in an instant, competitors that could outrun them without breaking a sweat, and environmental challenges that would make modern survival experts weep. But evolution doesn't care about fairness. It cares about adaptation. And in this crucible of prehistoric Africa, the pressure was so intense, so relentless, that it forged innovations in our lineage that would echo through millions of years to influence how you think, how you move, how you see the world, and even how you love. The first beast that shaped our destiny wasn't actually a beast at all. It was the landscape itself, and it was changing everything. 7 million years ago, the Miocene epoch was drawing to a close, and with it, the stable world our primate ancestors had known for millions of years. The climate was cooling, ice caps were forming at the poles, and the lush tropical forests that had covered much of Africa were beginning to fragment and retreat. This wasn't a gradual change happening over comfortable geological timescales. This was rapid, dramatic transformation that played out across mere thousands of years. Imagine entire ecosystems disappearing within a handful of generations. Rivers changing course overnight due to tectonic activity. Mountain ranges thrust skyward, creating rain shadows that turned verdant valleys into increasingly arid grasslands. Our ancestors found themselves caught in an evolutionary trap. They had evolved perfectly for life in the trees, with long arms for swinging, curved fingers for gripping branches, and eyes positioned to judge distances in three-dimensional forest canopies. But now, the trees were disappearing. The continuous forest highways they had traveled for millions of years were breaking up into isolated islands of woodland separated by expanding savannas. This is where the story gets interesting, because desperation breeds innovation. When your entire world is disappearing, you have two choices: adapt or die. And our ancestors, through a combination of genetic luck and environmental pressure, began to adapt in ways that had never been seen before in primate evolution. The first major innovation was subtle but revolutionary. Instead of simply accepting the loss of their arboreal highways, some of our ancestors began to venture down from the trees more frequently. not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. Food sources that had once been abundant in the canopy were becoming scarce, and the only way to survive was to exploit new ecological niches. But here's the crucial part. The ground wasn't empty. It was occupied by creatures that had been perfecting terrestrial life for millions of years longer than our ancestors had even existed. These weren't just animals sharing the landscape. These were evolutionary masterpieces, each one representing millions of years of refinement for specific ecological roles. And every single one of them was either a potential predator, competitor, or teacher for our vulnerable ancestors. Let's start with the predators, because understanding what wanted to eat our ancestors is crucial to understanding why we evolved the way we did. 7 million years ago, Africa was home to saber-toothed cats that make modern lions look like house pets. Machaerodus, the original saber-tooth, prowled these ancient landscapes with canine teeth that curved like deadly scimitars, perfectly designed for delivering killing bites to large prey. But Machaerodus wasn't hunting alone. The hyenas of 7 million years ago were nothing like their modern descendants. These were massive, bone-crushing predators called percrocuta, some species reaching the size of modern grizzly bears. Their jaws could splinter the thigh bone of an elephant, and they hunted in coordinated packs that could bring down prey many times their size. From the skies came death in the form of eagles so large they could snatch adult primates from treetops. Stephanoetus mahari, with a wingspan approaching 10 feet, had talons designed specifically for penetrating primate skulls. Fossils show clear evidence of our ancestors being taken by these aerial predators, with distinctive puncture marks in ancient skulls that match the spacing of giant eagle talons perfectly. Now, imagine being one of our ancestors, forced out of the safety of the trees by environmental pressure, only to find yourself in a world populated by these evolutionary killing machines. Every step onto open ground was potentially your last. Every venture away from the security of the remaining forest fragments was a gamble with death. But here's what's remarkable about evolution. Pressure creates diamonds. And the pressure our ancestors faced from these predators began to forge innovations that would define our entire lineage for millions of years to come. The first innovation was vigilance. Modern humans have an almost supernatural ability to detect threats in our peripheral vision. We can sense when someone is watching us from across a crowded room. We startle at sudden movements even when we're completely safe. These aren't quirks of modern psychology. These are ancient survival mechanisms forged by millions of years of being hunted by creatures that could kill us in an instant. But vigilance alone wasn't enough. Our ancestors needed to become smarter, faster, and more cooperative than they had ever been before. And this is where the story takes a fascinating turn, because the very predators that threatened our ancestors also taught them lessons that would prove invaluable for survival. Watch a modern chimpanzee encounter a leopard, and you'll see behavior that hasn't changed much in 7 million years. They scream warnings to their troop, they coordinate their responses, and they use tools like sticks and stones to defend themselves. But our ancestors, faced with even more dangerous predators, began to take these behaviors to entirely new levels. They started crafting more sophisticated tools, not just picking up convenient rocks, but actually modifying stones to make them more effective weapons. They developed more complex communication systems to coordinate group defenses, and most importantly, they began to think several steps ahead, anticipating predator behavior and planning escape routes before they were needed. These cognitive advances, driven by predation pressure, laid the foundation for everything that would make us distinctly human. Our ability to plan for the future, to communicate complex ideas, to work together toward common goals. All of these capacities have their roots in our ancestors' desperate struggle to avoid becoming dinner for saber-toothed cats and giant hyenas. But the predators weren't the only evolutionary pressure shaping our lineage. The competitors were equally important, and in some ways, even more influential. 7 million years ago, our ancestors weren't the only primates adapting to the changing landscape. They were part of a rich community of ape species, each one experimenting with different solutions to the same environmental challenges. Some of these ancient apes chose to double down on their arboreal lifestyle, developing even longer arms and more powerful gripping abilities to make the most of the remaining forest fragments. Others went in the opposite direction, committing fully to ground-dwelling life and evolving the robust builds and specialized digestive systems needed to process the tough, fibrous plants of the emerging savannas. Our ancestors chose a middle path, and this decision would prove to be one of the most consequential choices in the history of life on Earth. Instead of specializing completely for either trees or ground, they maintained flexibility. They could still climb when necessary, but they were also becoming increasingly comfortable on the ground. This flexibility came at a cost. They weren't as good at climbing as their fully arboreal cousins, and they weren't as efficient at ground dwelling as their terrestrial relatives. But what they lacked in specialization, they made up for in adaptability. And in a rapidly changing world, adaptability was the ultimate survival trait. The competition between these different ape lineages was intense. They were all vying for the same food sources, the same safe sleeping sites, the same access to water during increasingly frequent droughts. Natural selection was operating at maximum intensity, ruthlessly eliminating any lineage that couldn't keep up with the pace of environmental change. Our ancestors survived this competition, not by being the strongest or the fastest, but by being the most innovative. They were the first to systematically use tools to access new food sources. They were the first to develop the social cooperation necessary to defend prime territories from other ape groups. And they were the first to begin the long journey toward bipedalism, freeing their hands for tool use while maintaining the ability to cover long distances efficiently. This journey toward walking upright wasn't sudden. It was a gradual process that played out over millions of years, driven by the constant pressure to find new solutions to survival challenges. Every small improvement in upright walking ability provided advantages in terms of spotting predators over tall grass, covering long distances between food sources, and carrying tools and food back to safe locations. But perhaps the most important evolutionary pressure came from an unexpected source: the megafauna. 7 million years ago, Africa was home to animals so large and so abundant that they literally shaped the landscape itself. Imagine elephants twice the size of modern African elephants, with 4 tusks instead of 2, clearing paths through forests and creating open spaces wherever they traveled. These weren't just big animals living alongside our ancestors. They were ecosystem engineers, creatures whose mere presence transformed their environment in ways that created new opportunities and challenges for every other species in their vicinity. The paths carved by giant proboscideans became highways for our ancestors, allowing them to travel safely between forest fragments without exposing themselves to predators in open grassland. The wallows created by massive rhinoceros species became reliable water sources during dry seasons. The dung of herbivorous megafauna attracted insects that our ancestors learned to exploit as protein-rich food sources. But living alongside these giants also required our ancestors to develop new cognitive abilities. They had to learn the behavioral patterns of dangerous megafauna, understanding when a giant elephant was likely to charge and when it was safe to approach the fruit trees it had knocked down. They had to coordinate group movements to avoid being trampled by migrating herds of massive ungulates. Most importantly, they had to learn to think like ecosystem engineers themselves, understanding how their own actions could modify their environment to create advantages for survival and reproduction. This relationship with megafauna taught our ancestors something profound about cooperation and planning that would echo through millions of years of human evolution. When you're sharing territory with creatures that could accidentally crush you while scratching an itch, survival becomes less about individual strength and more about collective intelligence. Our ancestors began developing what we might call proto-cultural behaviors. They started passing down knowledge about megafauna behavior patterns from generation to generation. Which watering holes were safe during certain seasons, which migration routes to avoid, how to read the subtle signs that indicated when a massive herbivore was about to become aggressive. This knowledge sharing required increasingly sophisticated communication abilities. Simple alarm calls weren't enough anymore. Our ancestors needed to convey complex information about timing, location, and behavioral nuances. They began developing gestural communication systems, using hand signals to silently coordinate group movements when dangerous megafauna were nearby. But the most fascinating aspect of this relationship wasn't just about avoiding danger. Our ancestors learned to exploit the ecological disturbances created by megafauna. When giant elephants knocked down fruit trees, our ancestors were often the first small mammals on the scene, gathering fallen fruit before other competitors arrived. When massive herbivores created new clearings in dense vegetation, our ancestors quickly moved in to establish temporary campsites with excellent visibility for predator detection. This opportunistic relationship with megafauna began to shape our ancestors' social organization in ways that are still visible in modern human behavior. They developed the ability to rapidly mobilize group responses to unexpected opportunities. They learned to share information about resource locations across extended family networks, and they began to understand the concept of delayed gratification, sometimes following megafauna herds for days to be in position when feeding opportunities arose. The cognitive demands of this lifestyle were immense. Our ancestors had to maintain mental maps of vast territories, tracking the movements of multiple megafauna species across seasonal cycles. They had to understand complex ecological relationships, recognizing that the behavior of one species could predict resource availability or danger from entirely different species. These mental challenges drove rapid brain evolution in our lineage. The areas of the brain responsible for spatial reasoning, long-term memory, and social coordination began expanding dramatically. Our ancestors were literally thinking their way to larger brains, with each generation slightly better equipped to navigate the cognitive challenges of their complex environment. But brain tissue is metabolically expensive. Larger brains require more calories to maintain, and calories were often scarce in the changing landscape of 7 million years ago. This created an evolutionary arms race between cognitive ability and metabolic efficiency that would define human evolution for millions of years to come. Our ancestors solved this problem through innovation. They began using tools not just occasionally, but systematically. Stone tools allowed them to access nutrient-rich bone marrow from megafauna carcasses. Wooden implements helped them extract insects from tree bark and underground tubers from hard soil. Each technological innovation provided access to new food sources that could fuel their increasingly energy-hungry brains. The relationship between tool use and brain evolution created a positive feedback loop that accelerated both processes. Better brains led to more sophisticated tools. More sophisticated tools provided access to higher quality nutrition. Higher quality nutrition supported even larger brains. This cycle continued for millions of years, ultimately producing the human capacity for technology that would reshape the entire planet. Now let's talk about the herbivorous giants that dominated the landscape 7 million years ago, because these creatures created the ecological theatre in which our entire evolutionary drama unfolded. The Africa of the late Miocene epoch was home to proboscideans that make modern elephants look modest. Dinotherium, with its bizarre downward curving tusks, stood nearly 15 feet tall at the shoulder and weighed as much as 3 modern elephants combined. These weren't just scaled-up versions of familiar animals. They were entirely different evolutionary experiments in how to be a giant terrestrial herbivore. Dinotherium used its peculiar tusks like massive hoes, digging up entire root systems and stripping bark from trees with devastating efficiency. Wherever a herd of Dinotherium passed, the landscape was transformed from dense woodland to open parkland almost overnight. For our ancestors, these landscape modifications were both opportunities and challenges. The opened areas created by Dinotherium herds provided new foraging grounds where our ancestors could search for insects, small vertebrates, and scattered fruits without the constant threat of arboreal predators. But these same open areas also exposed them to different dangers, particularly from the swift ground-dwelling predators that specialized in hunting in open terrain. Our ancestors had to learn to exploit the temporary nature of these modified landscapes. They developed behavioral patterns that allowed them to quickly assess newly opened areas, harvest available resources, and retreat to safer territories before the ecological balance shifted again. This required remarkable flexibility in foraging strategies and social organization. The presence of such massive herbivores also created what ecologists call cascade effects throughout the entire ecosystem. When Dinotherium herds stripped vegetation from an area, it affected everything from soil composition to water drainage patterns. Smaller herbivores had to adjust their ranging patterns. Predators had to modify their hunting strategies, and our ancestors had to constantly adapt to these ever-changing ecological conditions. But perhaps most importantly, living alongside these mega herbivores taught our ancestors about the power of collective action. A single Dinotherium was an unstoppable force of nature, capable of demolishing trees that would take decades to regrow. But our ancestors learned that even giants had vulnerabilities. They observed how coordinated groups of smaller animals could sometimes drive mega herbivores away from preferred feeding sites through persistence and harassment. This observation may have planted the seeds for one of humanity's most distinctive characteristics: our ability to achieve through cooperation what no individual could accomplish alone. Our ancestors began experimenting with group strategies that leveraged their numbers and intelligence against much larger and more powerful creatures. They learned to work together to drive dangerous animals away from water sources during dry seasons. They coordinated efforts to scavenge from megafauna carcasses before larger scavengers arrived. And they developed the social structures necessary to maintain these cooperative behaviors across extended periods and changing circumstances. The herbivorous giants also inadvertently created the conditions that would drive one of the most important developments in human evolution: the shift toward meat eating. When massive herbivores died, either from old age, predation, or environmental stress, they created bonanzas of protein-rich resources that were simply too large for any individual scavenger to fully exploit. Our ancestors learned to monitor the health and movements of mega herbivore herds, positioning themselves to take advantage of carcass opportunities when they arose. This required sophisticated planning abilities, social coordination, and the development of tools capable of accessing meat and marrow from massive bones. The shift toward increased meat consumption had profound effects on our ancestors' biology. Meat is a much more nutrient-dense food source than the fruits and vegetation that had previously dominated their diet. This dietary change provided the additional calories needed to support larger brains, while also supplying essential nutrients like omega-3 fatty acids that are crucial for brain development and function. But meat eating also introduced new challenges. Unlike plant foods, which can be consumed safely over extended periods, meat spoils quickly in tropical climates. Our ancestors had to develop new social behaviors around food sharing, ensuring that large carcasses were processed and distributed efficiently before valuable resources were lost to decay. They also had to learn to compete more effectively with other scavengers, many of which were far better equipped for carcass processing than small primates. This competition drove innovations in tool technology and group coordination that would eventually give our ancestors decisive advantages in accessing high-quality food resources. The presence of megafauna scavengers, like giant hyenas, also created pressure for our ancestors to become more efficient processors of carcass resources. They couldn't afford to spend hours slowly gnawing meat from bones when massive predators were approaching. This pressure drove the development of more sophisticated stone tools capable of quickly separating meat from bone and accessing nutrient-rich marrow. These technological innovations required not just individual skill, but cultural transmission of knowledge across generations. Young individuals had to learn complex tool-making techniques through observation and practice. This created the foundation for cumulative cultural evolution, the process by which innovations are preserved, improved, and passed down through generations. The cultural transmission of tool-making knowledge also required enhanced social learning abilities. Our ancestors developed increasingly sophisticated capacities for imitation, instruction, and collaborative problem-solving. These social cognitive abilities would eventually become some of the most distinctive features of human psychology. But the story of megafauna influence on human evolution goes far beyond simple predator-prey or scavenging relationships. The sheer diversity of giant animals in 7-million-year-old Africa created a complex web of ecological interactions that shaped every aspect of our ancestors' lives. Consider the giant ground birds that roamed the ancient African landscape. Forus racids, terror birds standing 8 feet tall with massive hooked beaks, were apex predators in their own right. These flightless giants could run at speeds approaching 40 miles per hour and deliver bone-crushing bites to prey animals up to the size of small horses. Our ancestors had to develop entirely different survival strategies for dealing with these avian predators compared to the mammalian threats they also faced. Terror birds hunted primarily through sight and speed, making concealment and climbing ability crucial for survival. But their long legs and powerful beaks also made them formidable opponents even in wooded terrain, where our ancestors might have felt relatively safe from ground-dwelling mammalian predators. The presence of such diverse predator types created enormous pressure for behavioral flexibility in our ancestors. They couldn't rely on a single survival strategy because the threats they faced required entirely different responses. This pressure for behavioral flexibility may have been one of the key drivers of the enhanced cognitive abilities that would eventually distinguish the human lineage from all other primates. Our ancestors developed what we might call cognitive versatility, the ability to rapidly switch between different mental frameworks, depending on the specific threats and opportunities they encountered. When giant ground birds were in the area, they activated hunting-specific vigilance patterns, watching for the subtle head movements that preceded a terror bird's lightning-fast strike. When saber-toothed cats prowled nearby, they shifted to entirely different sensory priorities, listening for the soft pad of massive paws on forest floor and scanning for the telltale glint of eyes in shadowed undergrowth. This mental flexibility wasn't just about survival. It was reshaping the very architecture of our ancestors' brains. The neural pathways responsible for threat assessment were becoming increasingly sophisticated, developing the capacity to process multiple simultaneous danger signals and prioritize responses based on rapidly changing circumstances. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. The constant pressure from diverse predators didn't just make our ancestors better at avoiding death. It made them better at living. The heightened awareness required to survive in such a dangerous world also enhanced their ability to detect opportunities, recognize patterns, and make connections between seemingly unrelated events. When you're constantly scanning your environment for threats, you also become extraordinarily good at noticing everything else. Our ancestors began to recognize subtle environmental cues that predicted weather changes, seasonal migrations, and resource availability. They learned to read the landscape like a complex text, extracting information that less pressured species simply couldn't perceive. This enhanced environmental awareness created new possibilities for survival and reproduction. Our ancestors could predict where water would be available during dry seasons by reading subtle changes in vegetation patterns. They could anticipate the arrival of migrating animals by recognizing atmospheric pressure changes that preceded seasonal weather shifts. They could locate hidden food resources by following the behavioral cues of other species. The cognitive abilities that had evolved for predator avoidance were being repurposed for environmental mastery. Our ancestors were becoming ecological specialists, not in the sense of adapting to a single niche, but in the sense of becoming extraordinarily skilled at reading and manipulating their entire ecosystem. This ecological expertise required our ancestors to maintain incredibly detailed mental models of their environment. They had to track the seasonal movements of dozens of species, understand the complex relationships between climate, vegetation, and animal behavior, and predict how changes in one part of the system would ripple through the entire ecological network. The memory demands of this lifestyle were staggering. Our ancestors needed to remember not just where they had found food yesterday, but where similar resources had been available during the same season in previous years. They had to recall which water sources remained reliable during different types of droughts, which escape routes remained possible during different weather conditions, and which megafauna migration patterns could be exploited for scavenging opportunities. This cognitive load drove the evolution of increasingly sophisticated memory systems in our ancestors' brains. They developed enhanced episodic memory, the ability to recall specific events with remarkable detail and accuracy. They evolved improved working memory, allowing them to hold multiple pieces of environmental information in consciousness simultaneously while making complex decisions. But perhaps most importantly, they began developing what we might call predictive memory, the ability to use past experiences to generate detailed scenarios about future possibilities. This capacity for mental time travel would eventually become one of the most distinctive features of human cognition. The development of predictive abilities had profound implications for our ancestors' social lives. When you can anticipate future challenges and opportunities, cooperation becomes much more valuable. Our ancestors began forming alliances based not just on immediate mutual benefit, but on shared predictions about future resource availability and threat levels. These predictive alliances required increasingly sophisticated communication abilities. It wasn't enough to signal immediate danger or point toward visible food sources. Our ancestors needed to convey complex information about anticipated future events, coordinate group responses to predicted challenges, and negotiate agreements about resource sharing under hypothetical circumstances. The pressure to communicate about abstract concepts like future possibilities drove rapid evolution in our ancestors' vocal and gestural communication systems. They began developing proto-linguistic abilities, using combinations of sounds and gestures to refer to things that weren't immediately present in their environment. This communicative revolution had cascading effects throughout our ancestors' social organization. Groups that could effectively share information about future opportunities and threats had enormous advantages over those limited to responding to immediate circumstances. Natural selection began favoring individuals with enhanced abilities for abstract communication and collaborative planning. The social cognitive demands of this lifestyle created intense pressure for larger, more sophisticated brains. But brain tissue remains metabolically expensive, and the environmental challenges our ancestors faced were making high-quality calories increasingly difficult to obtain. This created what evolutionary biologists call a metabolic bottleneck that could have ended our lineage's journey toward higher intelligence before it really began. Our ancestors solved this problem through one of the most important innovations in human evolutionary history. They learned to cook. Not with controlled fire, that breakthrough was still millions of years in the future, but they discovered that certain types of environmental processing could make plant foods much more digestible and nutritious. They learned to use hot springs and geothermal areas to soften tough root vegetables. They discovered that crushing and fermenting certain fruits increased their caloric content. They figured out how to use the digestive systems of other animals to pre-process plant materials. harvesting partially digested vegetation from the stomachs of herbivorous megafauna. These food processing innovations provided the additional calories needed to support larger brains, while also freeing up digestive energy that could be redirected toward neural development. Our ancestors were literally eating their way to higher intelligence, using environmental manipulation to overcome the metabolic constraints that had limited brain evolution in other primate lineages. But the most remarkable aspect of these innovations wasn't their immediate survival value. It was their cumulative nature. Each generation of our ancestors didn't just rediscover these food processing techniques independently. They built upon the innovations of previous generations, gradually developing more sophisticated and efficient methods. This cumulative cultural evolution required our ancestors to develop entirely new capacities for social learning. They needed to be able to accurately observe complex behavioral sequences, remember detailed procedural information, and transmit technical knowledge to offspring and group members. These social learning abilities would eventually become the foundation for all human technology and culture. The feedback loop between enhanced nutrition, larger brains, better social learning, and more sophisticated food processing techniques created an evolutionary spiral that accelerated brain evolution in our lineage far beyond what environmental pressures alone could have achieved. Our ancestors were bootstrapping themselves toward higher intelligence through cultural innovation. This process also began to create the first glimmerings of what we might recognize as human social organization. Groups that were more effective at preserving and transmitting food processing knowledge had significant advantages over those that relied solely on individual learning. Natural selection began favoring individuals who were not just intelligent, but who were skilled at teaching, learning from others, and contributing to collective knowledge. The social dynamics around knowledge transmission created new forms of cooperation and competition within our ancestors' groups. Individuals who possessed valuable technical knowledge gained social status and reproductive advantages. But maintaining group cohesion required sharing this knowledge rather than hoarding it, creating complex social negotiations around information exchange. These negotiations drove the evolution of increasingly sophisticated social cognitive abilities. Our ancestors developed enhanced theory of mind, the ability to understand and predict the mental states of others. They evolved better emotional regulation, allowing them to manage the conflicts that inevitably arose around resource and knowledge sharing. And they began developing the capacity for moral reasoning, creating social norms that promoted group cooperation while managing individual competition. The emergence of proto-moral thinking had profound implications for our ancestors' relationship with the megafauna that shared their environment. They began developing what we might call conservation ethics, understanding that over-exploiting resources or unnecessarily disturbing giant herbivores could have negative consequences for the entire group's long-term survival. This ethical thinking wasn't based on abstract philosophical principles. It emerged from practical experience with ecological cause and effect relationships. Our ancestors learned through trial and error that certain behaviors toward megafauna led to predictable negative consequences, while other approaches created sustainable relationships that benefited everyone. They developed informal rules about carcass sharing that prevented destructive competition within groups. They created social norms around territorial respect that reduced conflicts with other primate species. And they began practicing what we might call ecological restraint, taking only what they needed from the environment rather than exploiting every available resource. These early ethical frameworks required our ancestors to think beyond immediate self-interest toward longer-term group welfare. This capacity for moral reasoning would eventually become one of the most distinctive features of human psychology, but its roots lie in the practical challenges of living sustainably alongside the megafauna of ancient Africa. The relationship between our ancestors and the giants of their world was creating a new kind of intelligence, one that combined individual cognitive abilities with collective knowledge, immediate problem-solving with long-term planning, and self-interest with group cooperation. This intelligence was unlike anything that had ever existed in the history of life on Earth. As environmental pressures continued to intensify, this hybrid intelligence would prove to be the key to our ancestors' survival. The forests continued to fragment, the climate continued to change, and the megafauna populations began to fluctuate in response to shifting ecological conditions. Our ancestors needed every advantage they could get to navigate these increasingly challenging circumstances. The stage was being set for the next chapter of human evolution, one that would see our ancestors begin to actively shape their environment rather than simply responding to it. The cognitive and social foundations laid during their relationship with the primordial beasts of 7 million years ago would soon support innovations that would change the trajectory of life on Earth forever. But that transformation was still in the future. For now, our ancestors were learning the fundamental lessons that would define human nature for millions of years to come. They were discovering that survival wasn't just about being strong or fast or well adapted to a particular environment. It was about being flexible, cooperative, and intelligent enough to thrive in a world of constant change. The primordial beasts that had initially seemed like nothing more than obstacles to survival had become the teachers that showed our ancestors what they were truly capable of becoming. In the shadow of giants, they were learning to think like gods. The lessons learned from living alongside these titans of the ancient world were about to be put to the ultimate test. Because 7 million years ago, Africa wasn't just changing slowly over geological time. It was convulsing with rapid, dramatic shifts that would challenge every survival strategy our ancestors had developed. The volcanic activity that had been rumbling in the background suddenly erupted into periods of intense geological upheaval. Massive ash clouds blocked sunlight for months at a time, causing temporary climate cooling that killed off vegetation across vast areas. When the ash settled, it created new soil compositions that favored entirely different plant communities. The ecological relationships our ancestors had spent generations learning to navigate were being reshuffled like cards in a cosmic deck. During these periods of environmental chaos, the megafauna populations that had been so central to our ancestors' survival strategies began to crash. Giant herbivores, dependent on specific vegetation types, couldn't adapt quickly enough to the rapidly changing plant communities. When the herbivores died off, the predators that hunted them faced their own survival crises. The entire ecological web that our ancestors had learned to read and exploit was unraveling before their eyes. But here's where millions of years of cognitive evolution under pressure paid off in ways that would determine the fate of our entire lineage. While other primate species struggled to adapt to the collapsing ecosystem, our ancestors did something unprecedented. They began to actively modify their environment to recreate the conditions they needed for survival. They started with small interventions. Using the stone tool technologies they had developed for processing megafauna carcasses, they began deliberately shaping their landscape. They cleared vegetation around water sources to create open areas where they could spot approaching predators. They built rudimentary barriers using fallen logs and rocks to funnel the movements of remaining herbivores toward locations where hunting and scavenging would be more efficient. These environmental modifications required our ancestors to think several steps ahead, anticipating how their actions would influence the behavior of other species and the flow of resources through their territory. They had to understand complex ecological relationships well enough to predict which interventions would have positive effects and which might backfire catastrophically. The cognitive demands of environmental engineering drove another leap forward in brain evolution. Our ancestors developed enhanced spatial reasoning abilities, allowing them to visualize how landscape modifications would look and function before actually implementing them. They evolved better sequential thinking, enabling them to plan multi-step projects that might take weeks or months to complete. Most importantly, they began developing what we might call systems thinking, the ability to understand how changes in one part of their environment would ripple through interconnected ecological networks. This capacity for understanding complex systems would eventually become one of the defining features of human intelligence. But environmental engineering couldn't be accomplished by individuals working alone. These projects required unprecedented levels of group coordination, with different individuals specializing in different aspects of landscape modification, while maintaining overall project coherence. Our ancestors had to develop new forms of leadership, communication, and social organization to make these collaborative efforts successful. They created what we might recognize as the first human work groups, with temporary hierarchies based on expertise rather than physical dominance. Individuals who understood stone tool production became project leaders when tools were needed. Those with the best knowledge of animal behavior took charge when interventions required predicting wildlife responses. This flexible, expertise-based leadership was entirely different from the rigid dominance hierarchies seen in other primate species. The social innovations required for environmental engineering also drove advances in our ancestors' communication abilities. They needed to coordinate complex activities across extended time periods, share technical knowledge about cause and effect relationships, and negotiate agreements about resource allocation and work responsibilities. Their proto-linguistic abilities expanded to include concepts like temporal sequencing, conditional relationships, and abstract planning. These communication advances had profound implications beyond just project coordination. Enhanced language abilities allowed our ancestors to share detailed information about environmental patterns, creating collective knowledge bases that far exceeded what any individual could accumulate through personal experience. They began developing what we might call cultural memory, preserving information about rare but important events like volcanic eruptions, extreme droughts, and megafauna migration anomalies. Cultural memory gave our ancestors enormous advantages during periods of environmental instability. When conditions shifted rapidly, they could draw upon generations of accumulated wisdom about how to respond to similar challenges in the past. They didn't have to rediscover survival strategies through trial and error. They could implement proven solutions immediately, giving them crucial head starts over other species facing the same environmental pressures. But cultural memory also created new evolutionary pressures within our ancestors' groups. Individuals who were skilled at preserving, organizing, and transmitting cultural knowledge gained significant reproductive advantages. Natural selection began favoring not just intelligence, but specific types of intelligence related to cultural learning and teaching. Our ancestors evolved enhanced abilities for pattern recognition, allowing them to identify recurring themes across different historical events and extract general principles that could be applied to novel situations. They developed better episodic memory, enabling them to recall specific details about past events that might be relevant to current challenges. And they began showing the first signs of what we might call wisdom, the ability to integrate knowledge from multiple sources and time periods into coherent guidance for decision-making. The emergence of wisdom-based leadership created entirely new social dynamics within our ancestors' groups. Older individuals, who in most animal species become liabilities as their physical abilities decline, began gaining status as repositories of crucial cultural knowledge. This shift toward valuing experience and wisdom over pure physical capability would eventually become one of the most distinctive features of human social organization. The respect for elderly wisdom also created incentives for our ancestors to extend their lifespans and maintain cognitive function well beyond their reproductive years. Grandparents, who could contribute valuable knowledge to group survival efforts, received care and protection from younger family members. This cooperative care of elderly individuals may have been one of the first examples of what we would recognize as human compassion and moral obligation. But the most remarkable development during this period wasn't just the preservation of existing knowledge. Our ancestors began innovating at an accelerating pace, building upon cultural foundations to create entirely new solutions to survival challenges. They entered what evolutionary biologists call a positive feedback loop between cultural and biological evolution. Enhanced cultural learning abilities allowed them to accumulate more sophisticated technologies and survival strategies. More sophisticated technologies provided access to better nutrition and safer living conditions. Better nutrition and safety supported larger brains and longer lifespans. Larger brains and longer lifespans enabled even more advanced cultural learning. This cycle continued to accelerate, driving rapid evolutionary changes in our lineage. The technological innovations emerging from this cultural biological feedback loop were unlike anything seen before in the animal kingdom. Our ancestors began creating composite tools, combining different materials and techniques to produce implements that were far more effective than simple stone or wood tools. They developed specialized tools for specific tasks, rather than relying on general-purpose implements for all activities. They also began showing evidence of what we might call technological planning, creating tools in advance of need, rather than just when immediate circumstances required them. This forward-thinking approach to technology required our ancestors to maintain mental inventories of potential future challenges and prepare appropriate solutions before those challenges actually arose. The ability to plan technologically for future needs represented a quantum leap in cognitive sophistication. Our ancestors had to be able to imagine hypothetical scenarios, evaluate the probability of different outcomes, and invest time and energy in preparations that might never be needed. This type of abstract thinking was approaching the levels of complexity that we associate with modern human cognition. But technology wasn't developing in isolation. The environmental modifications our ancestors were making to their landscape were becoming increasingly sophisticated and extensive. They began creating what we might call proto-agricultural systems, deliberately encouraging the growth of useful plants, while discouraging species that competed for resources or attracted dangerous animals. These early agricultural experiments weren't based on domestication in the sense we understand it today. Our ancestors were working with wild species, using controlled burning, selective harvesting, and habitat modification to increase the productivity of naturally occurring food sources. But they were beginning to understand the principles of ecosystem management that would eventually lead to full agricultural development. The transition toward active ecosystem management required our ancestors to develop increasingly sophisticated understanding of plant and animal life cycles, seasonal patterns, and ecological relationships. They had to learn which interventions would have positive effects on food production and which might disrupt the delicate balances that kept their modified ecosystems functional. This ecological knowledge was far more complex than the simple predator-prey and resource competition relationships our ancestors had been navigating for millions of years. They were beginning to understand concepts like nutrient cycling, seed dispersal, pollination, and succession that require thinking about ecosystems as integrated wholes rather than collections of independent species. The cognitive demands of ecosystem management drove another surge in brain evolution, particularly in areas responsible for abstract reasoning, long-term memory, and complex pattern recognition. Our ancestors' brains were becoming increasingly specialized for the type of systems thinking that would eventually enable humans to manipulate entire planetary ecosystems. But perhaps most importantly, the shift toward active environmental management was changing our ancestors' fundamental relationship with the natural world. Instead of seeing themselves as just another species trying to survive in a dangerous and unpredictable environment, they were beginning to understand themselves as agents capable of shaping that environment to meet their needs. This transition from environmental adaptation to environmental control represented one of the most significant turning points in the history of life on Earth. Our ancestors were discovering that they didn't have to accept whatever conditions nature provided. They could actively work to create the conditions they wanted. The psychological implications of this discovery were profound. Our ancestors began developing what we might call environmental confidence, a sense that they could overcome challenges through innovation and effort rather than just luck and genetic adaptation. This confidence would eventually become one of the defining characteristics of human psychology. Environmental confidence also created new forms of social cooperation within our ancestors' groups. When you believe that collective effort can overcome environmental challenges, investment in group projects becomes much more attractive. Our ancestors began undertaking increasingly ambitious environmental modifications that required sustained cooperation over extended time periods. These large-scale projects created the need for new forms of social organization. Our ancestors had to develop systems for coordinating work across multiple generations, since some environmental modifications took longer than individual lifespans to complete. They created informal institutions for preserving project knowledge and maintaining long-term commitments, even as group membership changed over time. The emergence of multi-generational thinking represented another cognitive breakthrough for our ancestors. They were beginning to understand themselves as part of continuous lineages, extending both backward and forward in time. This temporal perspective would eventually become central to human concepts of identity, responsibility, and meaning. Multi-generational thinking also created new ethical frameworks around environmental management. Our ancestors began considering not just the immediate effects of their environmental modifications, but the long-term consequences for their descendants. They developed informal conservation principles designed to ensure that their landscape management practices would remain sustainable across multiple generations. These early conservation ethics weren't based on abstract environmental philosophy. They emerged from practical understanding of ecological cause and effect relationships, combined with emotional commitments to offspring and group welfare. Our ancestors were learning that short-term exploitation of environmental resources could create long-term problems for their children and grandchildren. The development of conservation thinking required our ancestors to balance immediate survival needs against future sustainability concerns. This type of complex moral reasoning was far more sophisticated than the simple reciprocity and kin selection that had previously governed social behavior in primate groups. Our ancestors were developing what we might call ecological morality, understanding that their actions had consequences that extended far beyond their immediate social groups to include other species and future generations. This moral framework would eventually become one of the foundations of human ethical thinking. But the most remarkable aspect of this ethical development wasn't its abstract philosophical sophistication, it was its practical effectiveness. Groups that developed strong conservation ethics were more successful at maintaining productive environments over extended time periods. Natural selection was favoring moral thinking, because moral thinking led to better survival outcomes. The evolutionary success of ethical behavior created a positive feedback loop that accelerated moral development in our ancestors. Individuals who were skilled at moral reasoning gained social status and reproductive advantages. Moral thinking abilities became increasingly important criteria for mate selection and group membership. Our ancestors were evolving into moral agents, beings capable of making decisions based on abstract ethical principles rather than just immediate self-interest. This capacity for moral agency would eventually become one of the most distinctive features of human psychology. The emergence of moral agency also transformed our ancestors' relationships with the remaining megafauna in their environment. Instead of viewing large animals purely as threats, competitors, or resources, they began developing more complex ethical relationships that recognized the intrinsic value of other species. They created informal protocols for interacting with dangerous megafauna that minimized unnecessary harm, while still protecting human safety. They developed sustainable hunting practices that ensured prey populations could maintain themselves over multiple generations, and they began showing what we might recognize as the earliest forms of environmental stewardship. This ethical evolution was driven partly by practical considerations. Our ancestors had learned through experience that maintaining healthy relationships with other species was essential for long-term ecosystem stability, but it also reflected deeper changes in their cognitive and emotional capacities. Our ancestors were developing empathy, the ability to understand and respond to the experiences of other beings. This empathy extended beyond their immediate family groups to include other human groups, different species, and even abstract concepts like future generations and environmental systems. The development of empathy required our ancestors to overcome the narrow self-interest that had governed survival behavior for millions of years of evolution. They had to learn to value the welfare of others, even when it conflicted with their immediate personal interests. This capacity for empathetic thinking represented a fundamental transformation in the nature of consciousness itself. Empathetic consciousness created new possibilities for cooperation and social organization that went far beyond anything seen in other animal species. Our ancestors could now form alliances based on shared moral commitments rather than just mutual benefit. They could sacrifice immediate advantages for abstract principles like fairness, justice, and stewardship. These moral commitments became the foundation for increasingly complex social institutions within our ancestors' groups. They developed systems of informal law based on shared ethical principles. They created mechanisms for resolving conflicts through moral reasoning rather than just physical dominance. And they began practicing forms of collective decision-making that took into account the interests of all group members. The emergence of moral institutions represented another quantum leap in social evolution. Our ancestors were creating the first human societies, communities organized around shared values and principles, rather than just kinship and mutual benefit. These proto-societies would eventually become the foundation for all human civilization. But the most profound implication of this moral evolution wasn't social or practical. It was existential. Our ancestors were beginning to understand themselves as more than just biological organisms trying to survive and reproduce. They were becoming beings capable of purpose, meaning, and responsibility. This existential awakening was still rudimentary compared to modern human consciousness. Our ancestors didn't have the language or conceptual frameworks to articulate complex philosophical ideas about the nature of existence and meaning. But they were beginning to experience themselves as agents with moral obligations that transcended immediate survival needs. The capacity for existential thinking created new forms of psychological experience that had never existed before in the history of life on Earth. Our ancestors began experiencing what we might recognize as the earliest forms of spiritual consciousness, awareness of connections to something larger than themselves. This spiritual awareness wasn't based on supernatural beliefs or religious doctrines. It emerged from direct experience of their embeddedness in complex ecological and social networks that extended far beyond individual boundaries. Our ancestors were discovering that their existence was meaningful precisely because it was connected to larger wholes. The emergence of spiritual consciousness represented the final major cognitive breakthrough of this crucial period in human evolution. Our ancestors had developed not just intelligence, but wisdom, not just technology, but ethics, not just social cooperation, but spiritual awareness. They were becoming recognizably human. But this transformation was just the beginning. The cognitive, social, and spiritual foundations laid during this period would support even more dramatic developments as environmental pressures continued to intensify. Our ancestors were about to embark on the next phase of their evolutionary journey, one that would see them begin to actively reshape the world, rather than just adapting to it. The primordial beasts that had initially threatened our ancestors' survival had become the teachers that awakened their potential for transcendence. In learning to live alongside giants, our ancestors had discovered that they too could become giants, not in body, but in mind, spirit, and moral imagination. The stage was now set for the emergence of the first truly human communities. Societies organized around shared purpose, rather than just survival. But that story belongs to the next chapter of our incredible journey through deep time, when the descendants of these early pioneers would begin to actively engineer their own evolution through cultural innovation. The beasts were still there, still magnificent, still dangerous. But our ancestors were no longer just trying to survive alongside them. They were beginning to understand that they had the power to shape their own destiny, and with it, the destiny of all life on Earth. The transformation happening within our ancestors' minds during this crucial period wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something far more profound. They were developing what we might call temporal consciousness, the ability to exist simultaneously in past, present, and future. When a grandmother shared stories about the Great Drought 20 seasons ago, when a father planned next year's tool-making expedition, when a child practiced skills they wouldn't need until adulthood, they were all participating in a form of consciousness that transcended the immediate moment. This temporal awareness created entirely new forms of anxiety and hope that had never existed in any previous species. Our ancestors began worrying about events that might never happen and anticipating pleasures that were still years away. They developed what we might recognize as the first forms of human neurosis, the psychological burden that comes with being able to imagine multiple possible futures simultaneously. But this burden came with extraordinary gifts. Our ancestors could now learn from mistakes they hadn't made yet, by imagining their consequences in advance. They could prepare for challenges that existed only as possibilities in their minds. They could invest enormous effort in projects that wouldn't pay off for decades, sustained by their ability to visualize eventual success. The development of future-oriented thinking also transformed their relationship with death. Unlike other animals, which seem to experience death primarily as an immediate threat to be avoided, our ancestors began understanding mortality as an inevitable future event that gave urgency and meaning to present choices. They started making decisions based not just on what would keep them alive today, but on what would make their limited time meaningful. This awareness of mortality created the psychological foundation for what we might call heroic behavior. Actions taken not for immediate benefit, but for lasting impact. Our ancestors began undertaking dangerous missions to benefit their groups, not because they didn't understand the risks, but because they understood that some things were worth risking death to achieve. The emergence of heroic psychology represented a fundamental break with millions of years of evolutionary programming focused purely on individual survival and reproduction. Our ancestors were developing the capacity to value abstract ideals like group welfare, justice, and legacy above their own immediate safety. This psychological revolution would eventually enable humans to create civilizations, art, science, and philosophy. But heroic thinking also created new forms of competition within our ancestors' groups. Individuals began competing not just for resources and mates, but for social recognition and historical significance. They wanted to be remembered, to have their contributions acknowledged and celebrated by their communities. This competition for legacy drove another acceleration in cultural innovation. Our ancestors began creating increasingly impressive projects and artifacts, not just because they were useful, but because they demonstrated the creator's skill and commitment to group welfare. The first monumental constructions may have emerged during this period. Simple but impressive arrangements of stones or modified landscapes that served primarily as symbols of human agency and cooperation. These early monuments weren't just expressions of individual ego. They were collective statements about what our ancestors' communities could achieve through coordinated effort. Each monument declared to neighboring groups, to future generations, and perhaps to the universe itself, that humans were no longer just another species struggling for survival. They were agents capable of creating lasting changes in the world. The psychological impact of monument building on our ancestors' sense of identity and purpose was profound. When you can point to a massive stone structure and say, "We built that together," you begin to understand yourself as part of something larger and more enduring than individual existence. Our ancestors were developing the capacity for collective identity that would eventually enable the formation of tribes, nations, and civilizations. Collective identity also created new forms of conflict between different groups of our ancestors. As communities developed distinct cultural practices, technological innovations, and territorial modifications, they began defining themselves in opposition to other communities with different approaches. The first human wars may have been fought not over resources, but over whose way of life was superior. These cultural conflicts drove rapid innovation as different groups competed to demonstrate the effectiveness of their survival strategies. Communities that developed superior technologies, social organizations, or environmental management techniques gained advantages that could determine the survival or extinction of entire lineages. Natural selection was now operating at the level of cultures as well as individuals. The competition between different cultural approaches to survival created what anthropologists call cultural evolution, a process that could change human behavior and capabilities much faster than biological evolution alone. Within just a few generations, successful innovations could spread throughout entire populations, while unsuccessful approaches disappeared, along with the communities that practiced them. Cultural evolution also created the possibility of what we might call evolutionary mistakes, cultural practices that provided short-term advantages, but created long-term problems. Our ancestors began experiencing the first examples of unintended consequences, situations where their interventions in natural systems produced results they hadn't anticipated and couldn't easily control. These early experiences with unintended consequences taught our ancestors crucial lessons about the complexity of the systems they were trying to manipulate. They learned that even small changes in ecological relationships could cascade through entire environments in unpredictable ways. This understanding made them more cautious about large-scale interventions and more attentive to subtle feedback signals from their modified environments. The development of systems thinking also enhanced our ancestors' ability to understand social dynamics within their own groups. They began recognizing that changes in leadership, resource allocation, or work organization could have ripple effects throughout their communities that might not become apparent for months or years. This social systems awareness enabled our ancestors to become more sophisticated political thinkers, capable of anticipating how different social arrangements would affect group stability and effectiveness over time. They developed informal political theories based on their observations of cause and effect relationships in group dynamics. The emergence of political thinking created new roles within our ancestors' communities for individuals who were particularly skilled at understanding and managing social relationships. These proto-politicians gained influence not through physical dominance or technical expertise, but through their ability to anticipate and resolve conflicts before they disrupted group cooperation. Political specialists also became crucial for managing relationships between different communities. As our ancestors' environmental modifications created larger territories and more complex resource networks, they increasingly came into contact with other groups pursuing similar strategies. These encounters required sophisticated diplomatic skills to negotiate agreements about territory, resource sharing, and conflict resolution. The development of diplomacy represented another cognitive breakthrough for our ancestors. They had to learn to understand and predict the behavior of individuals from entirely different cultural backgrounds, with different values, communication styles, and survival strategies. This cross-cultural intelligence required even more sophisticated theory of mind abilities than managing relationships within their own groups. Diplomatic thinking also required our ancestors to develop new forms of abstract reasoning about fairness, reciprocity, and mutual benefit. They had to create agreements that would seem reasonable to groups with fundamentally different worldviews and priorities. This challenge drove advances in logical thinking and moral reasoning that approached modern levels of sophistication. The success of diplomatic relationships between different communities created opportunities for cultural exchange that accelerated innovation throughout the entire region. Communities began sharing technological knowledge, trading specialized resources, and learning from each other's environmental management experiments. This intergroup cooperation multiplied the rate of cultural evolution far beyond what any single community could have achieved in isolation. But cultural exchange also created new vulnerabilities. Communities became dependent on resources and knowledge from other groups, making them vulnerable to disruption if those relationships broke down. Our ancestors had to learn to balance the benefits of cooperation with the risks of dependency, developing strategies for maintaining self-sufficiency while still participating in beneficial exchange networks. The management of these complex intergroup relationships required our ancestors to develop what we might call strategic thinking, the ability to plan several moves ahead in competitive situations where other intelligent agents were also making strategic decisions. This game-theoretic reasoning represented one of the most sophisticated forms of abstract thinking that had yet evolved in any species. Strategic thinking also enabled our ancestors to begin actively shaping the behavior of other species, rather than just responding to them. They learned to manipulate the movements of herbivorous megafauna by creating artificial water sources and food concentrations. They developed techniques for encouraging predators to hunt in areas away from their own territories. They even began experimenting with what we might call proto-domestication, creating relationships with certain animal species that benefited both humans and the animals involved. These manipulative relationships with other species required our ancestors to develop unprecedented levels of understanding about animal psychology and behavior. They had to learn to think like the animals they were trying to influence, predicting how different interventions would affect animal decision-making processes. The capacity to model the mental states of other species represented a remarkable expansion of our ancestors' empathetic abilities. They were developing what we might call interspecies empathy, the ability to understand and respond to the experiences of beings with fundamentally different sensory capabilities, cognitive abilities, and survival priorities. Interspecies empathy also created new ethical frameworks around human relationships with other animals. Our ancestors began developing moral principles that recognized the interests and welfare of other species as morally relevant considerations in human decision-making. These proto-environmental ethics would eventually become the foundation for modern conservation thinking. The emergence of environmental ethics represented the culmination of the moral revolution that had been developing throughout this crucial period. Our ancestors had evolved from beings focused purely on immediate self-interest to moral agents capable of considering the welfare of other individuals, other groups, other species, and future generations in their decision-making processes. This expansion of moral consideration created psychological experiences that were entirely unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. Our ancestors began experiencing what we might recognize as the first forms of existential responsibility, the awareness that their choices had consequences that extended far beyond their own immediate experience. Existential responsibility created new forms of psychological suffering as our ancestors began to feel guilt and regret about past decisions that had harmed others. But it also created new possibilities for meaning and satisfaction through actions that contributed to larger purposes. Our ancestors were discovering that the most profound forms of happiness came not from satisfying immediate desires, but from participating in projects that transcended individual existence. The capacity for transcendent meaning-making represented the final major psychological breakthrough of this extraordinary period. Our ancestors had developed not just intelligence, but wisdom, not just social cooperation, but moral agency, not just environmental adaptation, but spiritual consciousness. They had become fully human in every sense that we would recognize today, but this transformation had come at a cost. The psychological complexity that enabled our ancestors to create meaning, purpose, and moral responsibility also made them vulnerable to new forms of suffering that no other species had ever experienced. They could now be tormented by regret about past decisions, anxiety about future possibilities, and guilt about their moral failures. The emergence of characteristically human forms of psychological suffering created the need for new coping strategies that went beyond the simple stress responses that had served their ancestors for millions of years. Our ancestors began developing what we might recognize as the first forms of philosophy, informal systems of ideas designed to help them understand and manage the complexity of conscious existence. These proto-philosophical frameworks weren't abstract intellectual exercises. They were practical tools for maintaining psychological stability in the face of unprecedented cognitive and emotional challenges. Our ancestors needed ways to understand their place in the universe that would enable them to continue functioning effectively, despite their new awareness of mortality, responsibility, and meaning. The development of philosophical thinking also created new forms of cultural specialization within our ancestors' communities. Some individuals showed particular talent for developing and articulating ideas about existence, meaning, and morality. These proto-philosophers gained social roles as counselors, advisors, and wisdom keepers who helped their communities navigate complex, ethical, and existential challenges. Philosophical specialists also became crucial for maintaining cultural continuity during periods of rapid change. When environmental pressures or social conflicts threatened to disrupt established ways of life, philosophical thinkers helped their communities adapt while preserving essential values and principles that defined group identity. The emergence of philosophical thinking represented the beginning of what we might call the human search for ultimate meaning, the quest to understand not just how to survive and thrive, but why existence itself matters. This search would eventually drive the development of religion, science, art, and all the other distinctively human activities that seek to comprehend and celebrate the mystery of being. But even as our ancestors developed these sophisticated cognitive and cultural capabilities, they remained embedded in the natural world that had shaped their evolution for millions of years. The megafauna that had been their teachers, threats, and resources were still present, still magnificent, still essential parts of the ecological systems that supported human life. The relationship between our ancestors and these ancient giants had evolved from simple predator-prey dynamics to complex partnerships based on mutual understanding and respect. Our ancestors had learned to read the moods and needs of individual megafauna, developing personal relationships with specific animals that lasted for years or even decades. These interspecies friendships weren't based on sentimentality or anthropomorphism. They were practical alliances that benefited both humans and animals. Our ancestors provided protection, medical care, and resource management services to their megafauna partners. In return, the animals provided transportation, labor assistance, and access to resources that humans couldn't obtain independently. The development of genuine interspecies partnerships represented one of the most remarkable achievements of this period. Our ancestors had learned to communicate across the species barrier, developing gestural and vocal signals that could convey complex information to animals with entirely different sensory and cognitive capabilities. These communication breakthroughs also enabled our ancestors to serve as intermediaries between different animal species, helping to resolve conflicts and coordinate activities across multi-species communities. They became ecological diplomats, using their unique position as intelligent, tool-using beings to facilitate cooperation throughout their entire ecosystem. The role of ecological diplomat required our ancestors to understand the needs, capabilities, and limitations of dozens of different species simultaneously. They had to maintain mental models of complex interspecies relationships and predict how changes in one part of the system would affect all the other parts. This cognitive challenge drove further advances in systems thinking and abstract reasoning. But perhaps most importantly, serving as ecological diplomats gave our ancestors a profound sense of purpose and belonging within the natural world. They weren't just another species competing for resources. They were stewards, facilitators, and healers working to maintain the health and productivity of entire ecosystems. This stewardship role created deep emotional bonds between our ancestors and the landscapes they managed. They developed what we might recognize as the first forms of environmental love, profound emotional attachments to specific places that went far beyond simple resource dependencies. Environmental love motivated our ancestors to make enormous sacrifices to protect and enhance their territories. They invested decades of effort in projects that might not benefit them personally, but would create better conditions for future generations and other species. This capacity for environmental altruism represented one of the highest expressions of the moral consciousness that had been developing throughout this period. The emergence of environmental love also created new forms of grief when ecological relationships were disrupted by climate change, natural disasters, or conflicts with other human groups. Our ancestors experienced the first forms of ecological mourning, profound sadness over the loss of beloved landscapes and animal relationships. Ecological mourning drove our ancestors to develop more sophisticated strategies for environmental protection and restoration. They learned to anticipate threats to their managed ecosystems and implement preventive measures before damage occurred. They also developed techniques for healing damaged landscapes, using their understanding of ecological relationships to restore productivity to areas that had been disrupted by natural or human causes. The capacity for environmental restoration represented the culmination of our ancestors' evolution from passive recipients of environmental conditions to active agents of ecological change. They had learned not just to adapt to their environment, but to heal it when it was damaged and enhance it when it was healthy. This healing capability would prove crucial as environmental pressures continued to intensify throughout the late Miocene epoch. Climate change, volcanic activity, and tectonic shifts were creating challenges that would have overwhelmed any species relying solely on biological adaptation. But our ancestors had developed tools, technologies, and social systems that enabled them to buffer environmental shocks and maintain stable communities even during periods of dramatic ecological disruption. The stage was now set for the next phase of human evolution, when these remarkable cognitive, social, and technological capabilities would be tested by environmental challenges that would push our ancestors to the very limits of their adaptive abilities. The primordial beasts that had shaped their evolution were about to face their own existential challenges, as the world they had dominated for millions of years began to transform in ways that would determine which lineages survived and which disappeared forever. Our ancestors stood at the threshold of becoming the dominant species on Earth, but that transformation was still far from certain. The next chapter of their story would determine whether the remarkable capabilities they had developed during this crucial period would be sufficient to carry them through the environmental catastrophes that lay ahead. The giants were still there, magnificent and powerful as ever, but for the first time in Earth's history, they shared their world with another species that possessed the intelligence, technology, and moral imagination to actively shape the future of life itself. The age of human influence was about to begin, but its ultimate outcome remained an open question that would be answered by the choices our ancestors made in the face of unprecedented challenges. The primordial beasts had taught them everything they needed to know about survival, cooperation, and transcendence. Now it was time to discover whether those lessons would be enough to navigate the transformations that would define the next chapter of life on Earth. The transformation our ancestors were about to face would make everything they had experienced so far seem like preparation for the real test. As the late Miocene epoch drew toward its climactic finale, the Earth itself was preparing to unleash changes so dramatic that they would reshape the entire trajectory of life on our planet. The volcanic systems that had been rumbling quietly in the background were building toward eruptions that would darken skies across entire continents. But it wasn't just the geology that was shifting. The very atmosphere was changing composition as massive forest die-offs released stored carbon, while reduced vegetation struggled to process the gases that regulate global climate. Our ancestors found themselves living through what geologists now recognize as one of the most dramatic environmental transitions in Earth's history, a period when stable ecosystems that had persisted for millions of years collapsed and reformed within mere centuries. The megafauna populations that had been the cornerstone of our ancestors' survival strategies began experiencing unprecedented stress. Giant herbivores that had thrived for millions of years suddenly found their preferred food sources disappearing. The massive browsers that had shaped entire landscapes through their feeding habits were facing starvation as the vegetation communities they depended on shifted faster than biological adaptation could accommodate. When Dinotherium herds began to shrink, it wasn't just a loss of individual animals. It was the collapse of entire ecological networks that had supported countless other species. The pathways these giants had maintained through dense vegetation began to close over. The clearings they had created for our ancestors to exploit became overgrown with thorny, inedible plants that provided little nutritional value and harbored dangerous predators. Our ancestors watched helplessly as water sources that had been reliable for generations dried up when the massive herbivores that had maintained them through their daily visits and wallowing behaviors disappeared from the landscape. Springs that had been kept clear by elephant traffic became choked with vegetation. Seasonal ponds that had been deepened by countless hooves turned into muddy depressions that couldn't hold water through the increasingly severe dry seasons. The psychological impact of witnessing this ecological collapse was profound. Our ancestors had developed deep emotional connections to specific landscapes and animal relationships. They had invested decades of careful management in creating sustainable interactions with megafauna populations. Now they were watching their entire world dissolve before their eyes, with no clear understanding of why it was happening or how to stop it. Some groups responded to the crisis by retreating to the remaining stable forest fragments, attempting to recreate the arboreal lifestyle their ancestors had abandoned millions of years earlier. But evolution doesn't allow species to simply reverse course. Our ancestors had lost the specialized anatomical features needed for full-time arboreal life. Their longer legs, shortened arms, and modified spine made them clumsy in the trees compared to their forest-dwelling cousins. More tragically, the forest refugees they sought were also under assault from the changing climate. The reliable rainfall patterns that maintained dense canopy cover were becoming erratic. Droughts lasted longer than the stored moisture in forest soils could support. When rains finally came, they often arrived as devastating floods that stripped topsoil and destroyed the root systems that held forest communities together. Other groups attempted to follow the retreating megafauna herds, migrating vast distances in search of the stable ecological conditions that had once been available locally. These migration attempts often ended in disaster, as our ancestors found themselves stranded in unfamiliar territories without the local knowledge needed to locate water, avoid predators, or find appropriate shelter materials. The migrations also brought different human groups into conflict, as population pressures forced them to compete for the same dwindling resources. The diplomatic skills and intergroup cooperation that had flourished during periods of abundance broke down under the stress of scarcity. Communities that had shared knowledge and resources for generations began hoarding information and defending territories with unprecedented aggression. But some groups chose a different path entirely. Instead of retreating to the past or fleeing toward uncertain futures, they decided to accelerate their evolution toward active environmental management. If the natural systems they had learned to exploit were collapsing, they would create artificial systems to replace them. These pioneering communities began undertaking landscape modification projects on scales that dwarfed anything attempted before. They didn't just clear small areas around water sources or create simple barriers to guide animal movements. They began reshaping entire watersheds, building extensive earthworks to capture and redirect water flow, and creating artificial ecosystems designed to support both human communities and carefully selected animal populations. The engineering challenges of these mega projects pushed our ancestors' cognitive abilities to new limits. They had to understand hydrology well enough to predict how water would flow through modified landscapes across multiple seasons and weather patterns. They needed to comprehend soil chemistry sufficiently to know which earthworks would remain stable over decades and which would erode away during the first major storm. Most demanding of all, they had to model the complex ecological interactions that would emerge in their artificial environments. Which plant species would thrive in the new soil and water conditions they were creating? How would animal populations respond to the modified landscape features? What unintended consequences might arise from their interventions? And how could those be predicted and prevented? The knowledge required for successful landscape engineering couldn't be accumulated by any individual working alone. These projects required the coordinated expertise of specialists who understood different aspects of environmental systems. Our ancestors began developing what we might recognize as the first scientific communities. Groups of individuals who shared knowledge about natural processes and collaborated on understanding cause and effect relationships in complex systems. These proto-scientific communities also developed the first formal methods for testing ideas about environmental relationships. When someone proposed a new technique for soil management or water control, the community would implement small-scale experiments to evaluate effectiveness before committing to large-scale applications. They learned to document results, compare different approaches, and modify their methods based on systematic observation of outcomes. The emergence of experimental thinking represented another quantum leap in our ancestors' cognitive evolution. They were learning to separate their beliefs about how the world worked from actual evidence about natural processes. This capacity for objective observation and hypothesis testing would eventually become the foundation for all scientific thinking. But experimental science also required our ancestors to develop new forms of intellectual humility. They had to accept that their initial ideas might be wrong and be willing to abandon cherished beliefs when evidence contradicted them. This psychological flexibility was difficult to achieve for beings who had evolved to rely on confident decision-making for survival. The tension between confidence and humility drove the development of what we might call scientific wisdom. The ability to hold strong convictions about the best available explanations, while remaining open to new evidence that might require revising those convictions. This intellectual stance required a level of psychological sophistication that approached modern human capabilities. Scientific wisdom also enabled our ancestors to begin understanding their own limitations as observers and thinkers. They recognized that individual perspectives could be biased or incomplete, making collaborative observation and discussion essential for accurate understanding of complex phenomena. This recognition laid the foundation for the social institutions that would eventually become formal scientific communities. The collaborative nature of scientific thinking also transformed our ancestors' educational practices. Instead of simply passing down traditional knowledge from older to younger generations, they began teaching methods for discovering new knowledge. Young people learned not just what their elders knew, but how to observe, experiment, and think critically about natural processes. This educational revolution created the first human communities where knowledge was expected to grow and improve over time, rather than simply being preserved unchanged across generations. Our ancestors were developing what we might call progressive cultures, societies organized around the principle that each generation should understand the world better than the previous one. Progressive thinking also changed our ancestors' relationship with tradition and authority. While they still respected the wisdom of their elders, they no longer accepted traditional knowledge as unquestionable truth. They developed social norms that encouraged respectful questioning of established practices and rewarded individuals who contributed new insights or improvements to existing techniques. The balance between respecting tradition and encouraging innovation required sophisticated social institutions that could manage the conflicts that inevitably arose when new ideas challenged established practices. Our ancestors developed formal processes for evaluating proposed changes, ensuring that innovations were thoroughly tested before being adopted, while also preventing entrenched interests from blocking beneficial improvements. These institutional innovations represented the emergence of what we might recognize as the first human governments, formal systems for making collective decisions about community policies and practices. These early governmental institutions weren't based on force or inherited authority, but on demonstrated expertise and community consent. The development of consensual governance required our ancestors to expand their moral reasoning abilities to include concepts like democratic participation, minority rights, and institutional legitimacy. They had to learn to distinguish between decisions that should be made by technical experts and those that required broader community input. Most challenging of all, they had to develop mechanisms for peaceful conflict resolution when community members disagreed about fundamental values or priorities. This required creating shared frameworks for moral reasoning that could provide guidance even when specific interests conflicted. The emergence of moral institutions transformed our ancestors' communities from simple survival groups into what we might recognize as the first human societies. Communities organized around shared values and principles, rather than just kinship and mutual benefit. These proto-societies created new possibilities for individual identity and meaning that extended far beyond biological existence. But the most remarkable achievement of these early societies wasn't their institutional sophistication. It was their success in creating artificial environments that were actually more productive and stable than the natural systems they replaced. Through careful observation, systematic experimentation, and collaborative planning, our ancestors learned to engineer ecosystems that could support larger populations while requiring less energy input than traditional foraging strategies. The artificial ecosystems created by our ancestors weren't simple agricultural plots in the modern sense. They were complex, multi-species communities designed to mimic and improve upon natural ecological relationships. Different plant species were arranged to provide mutual benefits through nutrient sharing, pest control, and moisture retention. Animal populations were managed to provide services like seed dispersal, soil aeration, and organic fertilization. These managed ecosystems also included our ancestors themselves as integral components rather than external manipulators. Human activities like harvesting, pruning, and soil cultivation were timed and coordinated to enhance overall system productivity, rather than simply extracting resources for human use. Our ancestors were learning to think of themselves as keystone species whose activities could benefit entire ecological communities. The integration of human activities into ecosystem management required our ancestors to develop unprecedented levels of self-discipline and long-term thinking. They had to resist the temptation to over-harvest during times of abundance in order to maintain system stability during inevitable periods of stress. They had to invest enormous effort in maintenance activities that might not produce immediate benefits, but were essential for long-term sustainability. This capacity for ecological self-discipline represented one of the highest achievements of the moral evolution that had been developing throughout this period. Our ancestors were learning to value the health of entire systems above their own immediate gratification, a psychological capability that required them to transcend millions of years of evolutionary programming focused on individual survival and reproduction. The success of their artificial ecosystems also created new forms of abundance that enabled our ancestors' communities to support larger populations and more complex social organizations. When basic survival needs were reliably met through environmental engineering, individuals could specialize in activities that weren't directly related to food production or immediate survival. Some individuals became full-time toolmakers, developing increasingly sophisticated technologies for environmental manipulation and resource processing. Others specialized in social coordination, becoming experts in conflict resolution, decision-making processes, and inter-community diplomacy. Still others focused on knowledge preservation and transmission, developing techniques for accurately storing and sharing the complex information needed to maintain artificial ecosystems. The emergence of occupational specialization created new forms of interdependence within our ancestors' communities. No individual could survive independently using only their own specialized skills. Everyone depended on the contributions of others for essential goods and services. This mutual dependence created powerful incentives for cooperation and social harmony. But specialization also created new vulnerabilities. If key specialists died or became incapacitated, entire communities could lose crucial capabilities. Our ancestors had to develop redundant training systems to ensure that essential knowledge and skills were preserved, even when individual experts were no longer available. The challenge of maintaining specialized knowledge across generations drove our ancestors to develop increasingly sophisticated systems for cultural transmission. They created formal apprenticeship programs, established repositories for storing important information, and developed techniques for verifying that knowledge was being accurately preserved and transmitted. These knowledge preservation systems represented the beginning of what we might recognize as formal education, organized efforts to ensure that each generation acquired the cumulative wisdom of their ancestors while also contributing new insights and improvements. Educational institutions became central features of our ancestors' communities, reflecting their understanding that knowledge was their most valuable resource. The emphasis on education also created new forms of social status based on intellectual achievement, rather than physical prowess or resource control. Individuals who made significant contributions to community knowledge gained respect and influence that often exceeded that of traditional leaders. Our ancestors were developing what we might call meritocratic values, social principles that rewarded contribution and competence over inherited privilege. Meritocratic thinking also transformed our ancestors' approaches to leadership and governance. Instead of accepting permanent hierarchies based on age, strength, or family connections, they began selecting leaders based on demonstrated ability to solve specific types of problems. Leadership roles became temporary positions tied to particular challenges rather than permanent sources of authority. The development of flexible, expertise-based leadership required our ancestors to overcome deeply ingrained primate tendencies toward dominance hierarchies and status competition. They had to learn to accept direction from individuals who might be younger, smaller, or less socially connected than themselves, as long as those individuals possessed relevant expertise. This psychological revolution enabled our ancestors to create much more effective problem-solving institutions than any previous primate society had achieved. When complex challenges arose, they could quickly organize response teams that included the most knowledgeable and capable individuals, regardless of their traditional social positions. The success of merit-based organization also created powerful incentives for individual self-improvement. Our ancestors began investing enormous effort in developing their own capabilities, not just for immediate survival benefits, but for the social recognition and influence that came with expertise. This drive for self-improvement accelerated the accumulation of knowledge and skills throughout their communities. But perhaps most importantly, the emphasis on merit and contribution created psychological experiences that were entirely unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. Our ancestors began experiencing what we might recognize as pride in achievement. Satisfaction derived not from dominance over others, but from mastery of complex skills and contribution to community welfare. pride in achievement motivated our ancestors to undertake increasingly ambitious projects that pushed the boundaries of what their communities thought possible. They began creating monuments, artworks, and technological innovations that served no immediate survival purpose, but demonstrated the heights of human capability and creativity. These creative achievements represented the emergence of what we might call aesthetic consciousness, the ability to appreciate and create beauty for its own sake, rather than just as a byproduct of functional activities. Our ancestors were discovering that the exercise of their highest capabilities was intrinsically rewarding, even when it didn't contribute to immediate survival needs. Aesthetic consciousness also created new forms of meaning and purpose that transcended individual existence. Our ancestors began understanding themselves as part of a creative force in the universe, beings capable of adding beauty and complexity to the world, rather than simply consuming resources and reproducing. This creative identity would eventually become one of the most distinctive features of human psychology, driving the development of art, music, literature, and all the other cultural activities that distinguish human societies from other animal communities. But its roots lay in the practical challenges of environmental engineering during this crucial period of ecological transition. The artificial ecosystems our ancestors created through their environmental engineering projects became laboratories for exploring the possibilities of creative design. They experimented with landscape arrangements that were not just functional, but beautiful, creating patterns and compositions that pleased the eye while also serving practical purposes. These aesthetic experiments taught our ancestors that beauty and function weren't opposed to each other, but could be integrated into unified designs that served multiple purposes simultaneously. They learned that environments designed with aesthetic consideration were often more psychologically satisfying for human inhabitants, and sometimes even more ecologically stable than purely functional arrangements. The integration of aesthetic and practical considerations in environmental design represented another cognitive breakthrough for our ancestors. They were learning to think holistically about complex systems, considering not just immediate functional requirements, but also long-term psychological and social effects of their interventions. Holistic thinking also enabled our ancestors to understand the connections between their own psychological well-being and the health of the environments they inhabited. They recognized that degraded or chaotic environments created stress and conflict within their communities, while well-designed, beautiful environments promoted cooperation and creativity. This understanding led our ancestors to invest significant effort in creating living spaces that supported not just physical survival, but psychological flourishing. They began designing their artificial ecosystems to provide opportunities for contemplation, social interaction, and creative expression alongside the practical functions of food production and resource management. The attention to psychological environment also drove innovations in social organization that went beyond simple problem-solving efficiency. Our ancestors began creating community institutions that were designed to promote individual fulfillment and social harmony, rather than just collective survival. They developed rituals and ceremonies that celebrated individual achievements, while also reinforcing community bonds. They created spaces and times for artistic expression, storytelling, and other activities that enhanced psychological well-being without serving immediate survival functions. They established informal mentorship systems that helped young people discover and develop their unique talents and interests. These social innovations represented the emergence of what we might recognize as the first human cultures in the full sense of the term. Communities organized not just around survival needs, but around shared values, artistic traditions, and collective aspirations for human flourishing. The development of full human culture also created new forms of identity that extended far beyond individual biological existence. Our ancestors began understanding themselves as carriers of cultural traditions that connected them to past generations and future descendants. They developed what we might call historical consciousness, awareness of their place in ongoing cultural narratives that gave meaning to individual lives. Historical consciousness also created new forms of responsibility, as our ancestors recognized that their choices would influence the cultural inheritance they passed on to future generations. They began making decisions based not just on immediate effects, but on long-term consequences for the cultural traditions and institutions they were creating. This expanded temporal perspective enabled our ancestors to undertake projects that might take multiple generations to complete, sustained by their understanding that they were contributing to ongoing cultural enterprises that transcended individual lifespans. They were learning to think and act like civilizational builders rather than just survival-focused individuals. The capacity for civilizational thinking represented the culmination of the remarkable transformation our ancestors had undergone during this crucial period of environmental challenge and adaptation. They had evolved from small groups of vulnerable primates trying to survive in a dangerous world to the founders of complex societies capable of actively shaping their own future and the future of life on Earth. So here we are, 7.1 million years later, sitting in our climate-controlled homes, scrolling through our phones, completely disconnected from the primordial drama that created us. Those ancient beasts, those titans of the Miocene, they're gone now. But their lessons live on in every fiber of our being. Every time you sense someone watching you across a crowded room, that's Macarodus teaching you vigilance. Every time you work together to solve a problem no individual could handle alone, that's the memory of our ancestors coordinating against giant hyenas. Every time you feel that deep, inexplicable connection to the natural world, that's the echo of 7 million years spent learning to read the language of ecosystems written by creatures larger than imagination. The next time you see a nature documentary about elephants or lions, remember that you're looking at the distant descendants of the teachers who forged your mind. The next time you feel overwhelmed by modern life's complexity, remember that your ancestors navigated challenges that would make our worst days seem like gentle puzzles. They didn't just survive the crucible of deep time, they transcended it, transforming from prey into philosophers, from survivors into stewards, from individuals into the first civilizations. The primordial beasts are gone, but their greatest creation remains: us. And the story they began 7.1 million years ago is still being written every single day. 7.1 million years ago is still being written every single day.